Shabbat Shalom to each and all from our beautiful congregation Bet Tefillah here in Scottsdale, Arizona. So friends, you may have heard of the Jew, the Arab, and the Christian who got together and they needed to share miracles that occurred to them. The Christian began and he said, you know what, it's funny, I was on a cruise ship and all of a sudden there was a terrible storm. So I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. And after I finished my prayer, 100 meters around us and our cruise ship, there was complete calm. The storm had passed. The Arab said, you know what, it's funny. I had a similar miracle. I was walking in the desert and all of a sudden there was a terrible sandstorm. So I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. And all of a sudden, 100 meters around me, there was complete calm and the sandstorm had passed. The Jew said, it's funny, I had a similar miracle. I was walking on the way to synagogue on a Shabbat morning. And all of a sudden, on the floor right there, I see a sack of golden coins and dollar bills. And I said to myself, shouldn't I? It's Shabbat today, I can't really touch money. But I was tempted. So I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. And all of a sudden, 100 meters around me, it was Tuesday morning. But friends, I'm thinking of this story today because it reminds me of yet again the sacrifices that are mentioned in this week's double portion of Tazriah Metzorah. Among the many sacrifices, some that were brought for a person who was struck with leprosy and others that were brought for people who wanted to ask for forgiveness. We are told that if a poor person brought a sacrifice on behalf of a rich person, then he had to bring a rich man's sacrifice. You see, there was a poor man's sacrifice, which was just 2 doves, and there was a rich man's sacrifice, which was a goat, because he could afford a goat. Now, if a poor man said, I'll bring a sacrifice on behalf of a rich man, he had to bring a rich man's sacrifice. But how does that make sense? He's a poor man. He doesn't have the money to bring a rich man's sacrifice. Why don't we give him a cut and tell him, you know what, you're a poor man, yes, you bring on behalf of this rich man, just bring a poor man's sacrifice because that's all you can afford. Why do we insist that he brings a rich man's sacrifice even though he cannot afford it? Yes, he's representing him, this rich man, but he cannot afford it. And the answer, my friends, speaks to one of the great secrets of life. The rich man that this poor man is representing the wealth, the state of mind that is wealthy, that now this poor man is assuming on his own by representing this wealthy man. When a poor man comes and says, I'd like to represent a rich man, what he's essentially saying, or even psychologically saying, he's stating that he is no poor man any longer. This man now, because he represents a rich man, is now in a state of mind of wealth. Once a person starts to think with this state of mind of wealth, then we expect him also to produce wealth and therefore to bring a rich man's sacrifice. This is one of the great psychological secrets that the Torah shares in this week's portion. We can choose to think like poor people, to think small, and to be small. Yes, we might have a small life, but the Torah expects us, and it shares this message with us in this specific halacha, to think big, to think like wealthy people, spiritually wealthy, emotionally wealthy people. And when we enter that state of mind of wealth, then we will be also able to produce wealth, to produce big things. It reminds me of what they say about elephants in a circus. But you may have heard that, and you may have seen yourselves, that elephants in a circus have these chains attached to their legs. Now why? And the reason is because they are afraid that the elephants will run away in the middle of the circus, so they attach them with chains so that they don't break off those chains and run away. But if you think about this, those elephants are so powerful that they could break those chains so easily. So why do they help? They help because those elephants were tied with those chains from a very young age. When they were young, they tried to break away from those chains, but they weren't successful. They weren't powerful enough then. So they grow up thinking that they can't and they will never be able to break away from those chains. When they're older and stronger, they can physically break away from their chains, but they think of themselves as those small elephants, those poor elephants, that once upon a time were just too weak and therefore remained too weak. So psychologically they think, even when they're old and strong enough to break away from those chains, that they simply cannot do it. This is the message of the Torah in this week's portion. If we think like poor people, if we think like those young elephants, and we think that yes, no chain can be broken in life, that's what we'll be. If we think like powerful elephants, like elephants that are not afraid of chains because they know their real might, if we think like that state of mind in that state of mind of wealth, like if we think big, if we think that nothing is indeed impossible, then that's what we will achieve too. Then we can achieve great things. Then impossible is nothing, like Adidas says. Friends, I think that this message is particularly relevant to our COVID-19 era, because indeed we are flooded with all sorts of emotions of despair, emotions of depression, emotions of confusion. We each sit on our home in quarantine not knowing what the future holds. But God expects us to think like wealthy people. Even though we might be in a poor state, we dare not succumb to that poor state. We dare think big, because if we think big, as the Torah again promises in this week's portion, we'll be able to produce big. And then no obstacle will be too tall. No challenge will be too difficult. We will indeed be able to overcome and prevail. As Yom HaZikaron is approaching next week, the day in which we remember the fallen soldiers who gave their lives, not just for Israel, but for the Jewish people everywhere. I want to conclude with the story of Aharon Karov. It's a story I've shared before, but it's a story that has remained engraved in my mind and in my heart. Ever since we met Aharon Karov with our community on one of the community trips to Israel a few years ago, we walked into a restaurant wanting to have lunch, and there was Aharon Karov sitting with his wife and young little daughter. I'll never forget how we then approached Aharon Karov and asked him to share his story. You see, we recognized Aharon Karov immediately because his face is, until today, very deformed. Why so? His story is a heart-wrenching story. 3 weeks, I think, after his marriage, he was asked to join his brothers and sisters at war in Gaza. He entered a booby-trapped home that exploded, and they pronounced Aharon Karov dead on the scene. They still tried to rescue him, helicoptered him to a hospital in Be'er Sheva, and they revived him miraculously. He indeed was revived. Life was reinvigorated in him. Miraculously, yet again, he was able to also recover in spite of the many very negative predictions by the doctors. When he recovered, he needed reconstruction surgeries on his face. He had 27 of them here in Tucson, Arizona, not too far away from here. Now, we bumped into him, and we can still see the effect that these surgeries had physically on his face. He came, he shared his story with us, and in the middle he said to us, look, I know it's very hard to look at me. My cheeks are not my cheeks, my nose is not my nose, my forehead is not my forehead, nothing that you see is mine. But then he pointed to his heart and he said, but this they'll never be able to touch. These words reverberate in my mind as we learn about this great secret in this week's Torah portion. Indeed, my friends, this, no matter the outside circumstances, this no one will ever be able to touch. This heart ought to think like a wealthy man. And if this heart thinks like a wealthy man, thinks big, continues to strive for big achievements, then indeed it will achieve them. It will achieve great things. and it will be able to break away from any chains that the world is maybe trying to impose on us directly or indirectly, and will be set free and create great things, light and freedom for our broken world. Shabbat Shalom.